Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to take you to the morning of June 18th, 1864. Private Payson Wolf trudged through the streets of Petersburg, Virginia, with other battered and bloodied Union prisoners of war. The captives were herded into an old tobacco barn with hundreds of other bluecoats to await their fate in the hands of Confederate military authorities. Only hours earlier, Wolf had come out on the wrong end of a rare nighttime assault, which put him and his comrades in an advanced position near the formidable defenses of the Cockade City. They'd been attacked by veteran North Carolina troops and compelled to surrender after a brief and brutal fight. The prisoners were quickly divested of their muskets. One company of the Tar Heels jumped at the opportunity to trade their worn weapons for the captured guns. They soon noticed that the wooden musket stocks had been ornately carved with fish, snakes, turtles, and other animals. Perhaps it was their first clue that these captives were no ordinary Union soldiers. In fact, Wolf and his comrades served in an all-Native American Company K, a unit of the otherwise white 1st Michigan Sharpshooters. Recruited a year earlier from northern Michigan, they hailed from the Odawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi nations. Wolf was an Odawa. His father was named Nyan Me-Ngun, which means wolf, a gray-eyed, yellow-haired chief who inherited his looks from a white grandmother. Wolf's mother, Kennequa, had the blood of a long line of chieftains coursing through her veins, though her grandmother was a French captive. Me-Ngun and Kennequa named their only son Payson, which means I leave this thing behind. Wolf might have followed in the path of his forefathers, but the arrival of a Vermont-born missionary named George Nelson Smith and his family in 1849 brought change. Smith heeded what he saw as God's clarion call to enlighten Native Americans and taught absolute equality between the races. Yet his beliefs were sorely challenged when Wolf asked him for the hand of his eldest daughter, Mary Jane. Smith knew that a refusal to consent to the Union would destroy his influence with the Native Americans and end his life's work. Smith, therefore, gave his blessing, and Wolf and Mary Jane were wed in 1851. He was 19, she was 16. They settled into a modest existence as farmers and started a family. Then, 10 years later, the war came, and with it, Wolf's eventual enrollment in Company K. The motivations that prompted him to join the Union Army are not precisely known. Raymond J. Herrick, in his regimental history, These Men Have Seen Hard Service, explained, many of the Indians joined because they believed the South was out to enslave all of them. The young warriors were going to fight for their own freedom, their homes, and their lands, where the graves of their families were located. Similar to the race-based hierarchy found in African American organizations, white officers commanded almost the entire Native American Company K. Quote, the Indians were drilled and disciplined in a way just like the other companies of the regiment, end quote, recalled Private Charles D. Bibbins of Company E of the regiment in a post-war letter, which also revealed an underlying and all too common bias against Native peoples. Quote, these Indians made fairly good soldiers, but could not be trusted with any special duty on account of their limited knowledge of English. They never associated with other soldiers, always keeping strictly to themselves from the time they joined the regiment until they were mustered out, end quote. Wolf and Company K were assigned with the rest of the Michiganders to the 9th Corps of the Army of the Potomac in early 1864. They arrived in time to participate in Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant's huge spring campaign against General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia. The advance began on May 4th, 1864. The Indians and the rest of their regiment proved their mettle over the next month in almost constant fighting. That included the battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. One officer observed that the men of Company K, while on the skirmish line, would camouflage themselves by rubbing dirt or mud on their blue uniforms, a practice that was soon adopted by the rest of the 1st Michigan. By early June, the Army of the Potomac had made serious gains against Robert E. Lee's Confederates, who were dug in behind breastworks. Grant acted with his characteristic aggressiveness. He ordered the army across the James River to capture the vital communications and supply hub of Petersburg, and then to move against Richmond from the south. A coordinated movement by the Union Army of the James, commanded by Major General Benjamin Butler, would strike lightly defended Petersburg from the east. The Michigan Sharpshooters and other units in the 9th Corps participated in the eastern attacks. The assault on Petersburg began on June 14th and continued over the next 4 days. But the Confederates managed to reinforce their lines before the Federals could mass enough firepower to break through, and the momentum stalled. Union forces finally scored a breakthrough before dawn on June 17th, after a division commanded by Brigadier General Robert Potter captured a mile of enemy lines along a salient near a local farmhouse. But supporting attacks intended to exploit Potter's gains were not launched until the early afternoon, and they were uncoordinated and ineffective. Failures here allowed the Confederates to rally and reform behind the house. At 6 p.m., a new Union attack was launched against the reformed Confederate line, and the Michigan Sharpshooters participated. Positioned on the far right flank, they charged with their comrades and pushed back the enemy. The firing ended after sunset, with Union forces occupying an advantageous position. Wolf and Company K set up a defensive perimeter along with the rest of the regiment. They had a quick bite to eat and prepared to snatch a few hours of rest before the fighting resumed the next day. But at 10 p.m., about 500 North Carolinians launched a surprise attack against the 200-strong Michigan regiment. The firing was so close that uniforms were singed with gunpowder blasts. The sharpshooters managed to hold the line and captured about 80 rebels. Still, the fight took a heavy toll in casualties. About 100 sharpshooters, including Wolf, were left to maintain the position. Then, the North Carolinians launched a new attack and overwhelmed the sharpshooters on the front, the left flank, and the rear. The Michiganders had no choice. They were forced to surrender. Wolf and 14 other Native Americans in Company K numbered among the prisoners who arrived in Petersburg with other captured Union soldiers. They were held there for 3 days and then loaded onto trains bound for prisoner of war camps. Meanwhile, U.S. Grant settled in for what was going to be a long and costly siege. Company K and other members of the sharpshooters were sent to Georgia and imprisoned in the hell that was Andersonville. Private Bibbins, who had been captured about a week earlier at Cold Harbor, was also there. He recalled an incident between Company K and the notorious Andersonville Raiders, a group of rogue Union captives who preyed upon their fellow prisoners. The Native Americans, Bibbins recalled, possessed watches, chains, rings, and earrings. Quote, they came into Andersonville with plenty of these trinkets, he recalled, and the famous raiders who rolled Andersonville at the time proceeded to relieve them of their jewelry the second night after their arrival. But the Indians, back to back in a bunch, cut and slashed the raiders until they were obliged to quit the fight, with 2 killed and several wounded. They were not bothered after that. End quote. Wolf had his own recollection of the horrors of Andersonville. According to his father-in-law, George Smith, quote, he says they suffered terribly in prison, going sometimes 2 to 3 days and a number of times 4 days without eating at all. They were robbed of their blankets and overcoats and lived and slept in the open weather, end quote. Smith continued, quote, he says, Payson speaking, he says that the men got so weak that they could not keep their rations down and would vomit beans as soon as swallowed. He added, sometimes the boiled rice would be alive with full-grown maggots, end quote. Wolf's health declined during the summer months in Andersonville and into the autumn of 1864. His captain, James S. DeLand, remembered, quote, he was attacked with diarrhea first and then with scurvy. His gums swelled. Part of his teeth fell out. His legs and arms swelled to a monstrous size. His muscles contracted badly so that it was difficult to move at all. One of his fingers was infected with gangrene. In December 1864, after 5 months in Andersonville and another month at Camp Oglethorpe in Millen, Georgia, Wolf was released and sent to the North. Union authorities gave him a 30-day furlough and sent him to Michigan. Quote, he returned home a half-killed victim of our dear Southern brethren's worse than savage cruelty, end quote, wrote one friend who saw Payson Wolf after he arrived. Wolf, it turns out, was one of the lucky ones. Of the 15 Native Americans from Company K imprisoned at Andersonville, 7 died. Wolf was out of commission for months. He finally returned to Company K in May of 1865. While he was away, the surviving Michigan Sharpshooters became the first regiment to occupy Petersburg after Confederates evacuated the city on April 2nd and 3rd, 1865. The Sharpshooters mustered out of the Army in July of 1865. Wolf returned to Michigan and rejoined his family, which grew to include 13 children. Soon after the birth of their last child, Mary Jane divorced Wolf, citing his bad habits. Bad habits acquired in the war. He did not remarry and lived until about age 67, dying in 1900. So there you have the story of Payson Wolf, a sharpshooter in Company K of the 1st Michigan, and his ordeal at the Battle of Petersburg and his imprisonment in Andersonville. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.